I've got two spectacular looking IEM cables here that have exactly the same geometry but some slightly different internal materials, so I was interested to see what that did to the sound and how well they performed. For those that are immediately inspired to rage quit, I hope the next video you go and watch is more enjoyable for you. For those of you that actually want to talk about cables, let's have a chat about the FiR Audio Chord 24 and Chord 24C. The Chord 24 is the blue cable here, and it uses a silver-plated copper in, as I said before, a fairly unique geometry. Not completely unique, but fairly unique. And then the purple one I've got here is the Chord 24C. This uses pure copper cable. It's the same general geometry, but it is a little tiny bit thinner than the Chord 24. What makes these cables a little bit unique is they're using a combination of some solid cores through the center of the cable, and then some more traditional stranded bundles around the outside. In both cases, it's one type of metal, so it's all silver-plated copper and it's all copper, but they're both otherwise using that same combination of solid core and bundles around the outside. I'm going to jump pretty quickly into sound quality, but the first thing I'm going to say is that the design and hardware on these is nothing short of spectacular. I'm normally more of a fan of braided cables, and that does remain true, even with these being as good as they are. And what I mean by that is that at the end here, you can see that all the cables are contained within a single sheath. Now, personally, I find a braided cable a bit more gentle, a bit more soft to wear, and so I'm not as much a fan of this, but as far as versions of this type of design, I think this is fantastic. And what really sets these apart is the really unique hardware. So we've got the 4.4mm plug there. That's also using FiR Audio's, I think it's called Connex from memory, that allows you to change the plugs if you want to. So you can have 4.4, 3.5, 2.5, etc. We've then got a similar looking style design up at the Y-split. So the top little piece of this gold does come up and act as a cinch for you. And that's the same on the purple cable as well. So identical hardware, just different color schemes. So it's very, very beautiful, very high quality, hard wearing. It's all metal in terms of the hardware. And then you've got this wonderful quality insulation that, as I said, I do prefer braid, but as far as this type of design goes, this is fantastic. The question then, of course, comes down to how do they sound? And that's a bit trickier to answer. Not because cables don't make a difference, but because each of them has their strengths and weaknesses. And so I thought the best way I could compare these was just to move through a range of different cables with different metals and talk about what I heard. So what I've got in front of me here is the Aries S8W cable, also from FiR Audio. In fact, all of these are, so thank you to FiR Audio for providing the samples. This is a pure copper cable, so it's essentially a comparison with the purple Chord 24C, and I should mention at this stage, the Chord 24C is a limited edition. There's only 500 units of this one, and it's also the cheaper cable. So if you like what I'm going to say about the Chord 24C, jump on this one fast. The Chord 24 will be an ongoing model as far as I understand it. But back to what we've got going on here, and I'll tell you prices in a moment as we go through the comparisons. We've got the Aries S8W, that's pure copper. That's going to go up against the Chord 24C. We're then going to compare the Chord 24C with the Chord 24. So essentially the same geometries but with different metals. And then I'll go the next step again and put the Chord 24C up against the Fusion 1 cable, which is again a combination of metals. The geometry is more like a traditional cable, but it's using a combination of gold-plated silver, and pure copper. And so hopefully by the end of this, I can just give you a sense of the strengths and maybe the weaknesses, depending on your taste, of each of these different cables and the sorts of IEMs they might work with. For all of this testing, I used the exact same source, and that was this beast here. This is the xDuoo XD05 Pro. It just arrived the other day, courtesy of APOS, and I have to say I am absolutely blown away by this unit. I haven't done thorough listening tests yet or comparisons, but what it offers in terms of power, versatility, the ability to swap DAC modules and amplifiers or op amps is absolutely phenomenal. So check out the review for this one when it comes, and make sure you subscribe if you want to see that one. But the reason I raise it is that this was the source for everything. I was running it specifically with the AK4499EX DAC card and a pair of OPA 1612 op amps. Playback was done from Roon, fitting directly into the XD05 via USB. And I decided to land on a single track and work my way through each of these on a single track. I'll then provide some extra comments later about some other tracks that I tried. But for the sake of this initial comparison, I was always using Miranda by Fleetwood Mac. Starting off with the Aries S8W cable, which is a $279 cable from FiR Audio. For all my testing, I was also using a pair of FiR Audio Radon 6 Customs. I've got another video coming up all about those customs and the process of getting them made, but they're the IEMs I use for all of this because they're one of the best IEMs on the planet in my opinion. And so kicking things off with the Aries S8W connected to the Radon 6s, the Aries S8W is a pure copper Litz cable and it comes in at $279. Listening to Miranda via that setup, and the start of this track has this wonderful crisp guitar sound to it. There's also a shaker used early on, and it had a nice sense of texture without being enhanced in any way. The bass throughout the track had a nice sense of weight and impact, but I would also describe the sound as being a little bit rounded, and you'll know why I'm talking about it as rounded shortly when we talk about the other cables. Kicking things off, the image separation was very solid, there was nothing to complain about, but at this early stage I also had no reference point, so this was kind of my baseline starting point to hear what happened as I changed through the cables. Moving over then to the Chord 24C, which was the purple one, the limited edition one, and this one comes in at $499. What I found with the Chord 24C was that now the opening guitar had a little bit more sense of attack, but it also seemed to have a bit more weight and presence in its sound as well. That shaker I mentioned before stayed about the same, so no major differences there. But I did find as the track went on that, to me, the Chord 24C was delivering a greater sense of attack. It wasn't making it harsh or overly enhanced in any way, but it just seemed to have a little bit more sense of energy, attack, transient speed, whatever you want to call it. I mentioned before that the bass from the Aries S8W was a little bit rounded sounding, and that tightened up a little bit from the Chord 24C. It didn't lose any of the body and the presence, but it just got a bit more control and a bit more punch to it. Finally, I feel like the image separation maybe got just a little bit better with the Chord 24C, but there is a bit of a lag when you're switching cables, and so it's not big enough of a difference that I would make a decision based on that alone. So in other words, if you actually like the sound of a slightly smoother bass presentation, if you don't want as much attack, then the Aries S8W is probably going to be just as good in most other ways. But if you do like a little bit of extra resolution in the attack and the transients, if you like a tighter, punchier bass without losing out on anything, that's where the Chord 24 could be a really good choice. And so from there, after really liking what I was hearing, going from the Aries S8W to the Chord 24C, and I think a moment ago I might have said Chord 24, but in this last section it's always been the Chord 24C I've been talking about, because now we're going to talk about what happens when you go from the Chord 24C over to the Chord 24. So as a reminder, we're going from a pure copper using the combination of solid cores and outer bundles to a silver-plated copper cable where every wire is silver-plated copper, but we're still using the combination of solid cores and outer bundles. As I said before, the Chord 24C, the purple one, is a limited edition at $499, and going to the Chord 24, the blue one, the silver-plated one, that jumps us up fairly significantly to $799. So it's a very big jump. What I immediately noticed listening again to Miranda, so we've got the same reference throughout this, was that there were details that the Chord 24 brought forward that I didn't even hear with the Chord 24C. So what I was hearing was there was sounds of, I think maybe the fingers on the guitar strings that jumped out a little bit when I was using the Chord 24, whereas the plain copper 24C didn't bring those forward. If I went back and listened, I could probably find them, but they weren't as evident and they weren't as obvious. That also made that shaker a little bit more present and prominent from the Chord 24. And what was really interesting was that the bass also seemed to have more heft to it. It was a weightier, more solid bass presentation. Not by a huge amount, but by a little. So essentially what I was hearing was that the sense of attack and resolution increased, but also the bass weight and presence did too. I wouldn't describe this as a full, rich or rounded sounding bass, but it had a really good sense of presence and energy to it. In other words, the Aries S8W is still the smoothest sounding bass. The Chord 24C kind of ups the tightness of that, and that same tightness is maintained over on the Chord 24, but I think the level of presence and weight maybe increases a bit from the Chord 24C to the Chord 24, whilst maintaining the tightness and the punch. The other thing that the increased resolution and detail, and attack for that matter, from the Chord 24 did, was it also made the image separation just a little bit better again. Again, it wasn't a huge step. I do sometimes find that silver-plated cables can really ramp up things like the detail, attack, and therefore separation, but I don't think it was as drastic going from the Chord 24C to the Chord 24 as it has been with other cables. When I reviewed just recently the Aries S8W up against the Effect Audio Limited Edition Christmas cable, which was a combination of the copper from the Aries and the silver-plated copper from the Cadmus cable, In that comparison, that combination of copper and silver-plated copper really separated sounds out more. I didn't find that as much with the Chord 24. And that's both good and bad. For me, it makes the overall presentation of the sound more natural, but at the same time, it also means you're not going to get that experience of having all the sounds kind of separated out, pulled apart, so you can look in and focus on each one very, very easily. You have to do a little bit more work with these cables to pull apart the sound within your head, and that can be good or bad depending on your tastes. And so by this point, I was in a really interesting position. Almost always I find myself preferring pure metal cables such as the Chord 24C over silver-plated or other type hybrid variants. And yet on this particular test, I was swaying back and forth between the two. And at this stage at least, I thought maybe I preferred the Chord 24. Its ability to bring that extra resolution and detail without too much fatigue, also having that beautiful tight, punchy bass and a little bit more sense of energy in that bass compared to the Chord 24C, I was thoroughly enjoying. And so knowing how much I love the Fusion 1 cable from Effect Audio, I thought that might be a good place to go next and see how both of the Chord 24C and Chord 24 compare up against the Fusion 1. As I mentioned before, the Fusion 1 here is a hybrid design. It doesn't use any of the solid core stuff going on in the Chord series, and instead what it uses is strands of gold-plated silver, and pure copper. The Fusion 1 comes in at $899 US, so it's $100 more than the Chord 24, the blue silver-plated copper cable. And going between the Chord 24 and the Fusion 1, what was very interesting was to hear that the sense of clarity was similar but different. And what I mean by that was that there was still the same amount of clarity and attack and resolution from the Fusion 1, but the sound came across a little bit warmer overall somehow. The bass from the Fusion 1 to me took a little bit of a step back compared to the 24C in terms of energy and presence. It was still very tight, it still had great control, but it didn't have quite as much heft to it as I was getting from the Chord 24. Where things were very different between the two for me though was image separation. The Fusion 1 really helped to split apart the sound a bit more. It's different again than what I described in the Aries S X Cadmus cable, that sort of Christmas cable I spoke about before. It doesn't do it quite as extremely as I found that did, but it was definitely separating the sounds out more within the soundstage than the Chord 24 did. And so at this point, I was having a really tough time choosing which of these cables I liked the best with the Radon 6s, that being the FiR Audio IEMs. And so this was the time for me that I wanted to try a different track. Another track that I tried as part of this was The Blower's Daughter by Damien Rice, and I felt like somehow the Fusion 1 was just a little bit more insightful on a quieter track like this. In Miranda by Fleetwood Mac, there was a lot going on. In the case of The Blower's Daughter, it's very simple. We've got vocal, we've got guitar from memory, I know we've got a cello, and I could hear more of the space around the vocals, more of the vocal qualities from Damien Rice through the Fusion 1. And that's not to say that the Chord 24 was any slouch, but the Fusion 1 just helped me gain a little bit more insight into the sound. And so I stuck with The Blower's Daughter for a while, and I switched between all three of these kind of over and over again because I was having so much trouble separating them. And what I found was that ultimately I actually came back to the Chord 24C as my preference. So this is the cheapest cable of the bunch, was actually the one that I liked the most with the FiR Audio Radon 6. As always, different cables will suit different IEMs more. If you've got a smoother, warmer sounding IEM and you want to give it a bit of extra energy in the transients and the attack, then the Chord 24 could be the better choice. But with an IEM that's already very well balanced, very detailed and very resolving, the Chord 24C absolutely nailed it for me. It was the most consistently natural sounding combination, for me at least, across a whole range of tracks and also with different sources. I've also tried these cables with the Chord Mojo 2 and the FiR Audio Radon 6 once again, and consistently, it's actually the Chord 24 that I keep coming back to. That's not to say that it is hands down the better cable, it's just the one that I tend to prefer. And it's because for me, it delivers the music without any sense of enhancement anywhere. It allows me to hear what I want to hear, not force me to hear any particular details. Now, having said that, some of you are absolutely going to love what the Chord 24C does by delivering that extra little bit of energy and detail. And then others will love what the Fusion 1 does because, as I said before, it helps to strip apart the sound a bit more and give you more insight. But to my ears and with my source chains, both the Fusion 1 and the Chord 24 could occasionally make the Radon 6s just a touch fatiguing for me. whereas the Chord 24C almost never did. And so whichever way you go, I don't think you can go too far wrong with these. But there's a couple of things worth mentioning before I wrap up here, and these are non-sound quality related points. The first thing I'd say is that I'm not here for a second suggesting that you should spend this sort of money on an IEM cable unless you're using true flagship IEMs. There is absolutely no reason to spend this kind of money on an IEM cable if your IEMs aren't worth at least more than the cables, if not maybe double or triple the price of the cables. These make sense with flagship IEMs. Something like the Hyphenman's FiR is probably the lowest point, around about say $2,000 US. That's about the point at which I think these cables start to make sense as an investment. If you're running a pair of Zen's top, so we're talking $500 or $600 IEMs, don't spend more than the IEM on the cables. It's a total waste of money. You're much better off to put that money into a better IEM. It's going to give you far better gains. But if you know that you want to buy a nice cable and then continue to climb the IEM ladder, or if you've already got your endgame IEM and you're looking for the perfect cable, that's where I think these could make some sense. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about just briefly is ergonomics. I did allude to this at the beginning, and that is that I find a braided cable like the Aries S8W here to be more comfortable overall than these kind of single sheath designs. So if we look at the Chord 24, what we've got if we look at this one is that the two channels, the left and the right channel, leave the plug each in its own individual sheath. That then goes up to the wire split with a nice twist in it, and then after the wire split, we've got one sheath per side. Now that's nice in the sense that it's clean, it looks nice. The problems that I have with it is that, I don't know if you can see here, it's holding a little bit of its shape. It's not quite as soft. If I take the Aries S8W, which is still a fairly chunky cable in the scheme of things, but I find it's more prone to want to kind of go where I want it to go. It's got a little bit of its own desire to have its own shape, but less so than I find with cables like the Chord 24, Chord 24C and Fusion 1. So that's something to take into account. It doesn't make these cables bad, but personally, I do find myself preferring a braided cable. The other thing that I noticed as I listened to these was that I find the weight of these does get a little bit heavy as it goes over the top of the ear. So the thickness of the cable combined potentially with the, not rigidity because they're not rigid, but the less sense of softness, I'm going to call it, which is a weird way of saying it, but less sense of softness from these single sheath designs. I found that occasionally I became really aware of where it crossed over the top of the ear. And so that is worth taking into account as well. The overall weight and design of these cables may make them less ergonomically enjoyable for some people. So keep that in mind before you dump a bunch of cash into cables like these. But having said all of that, if what you're focused on is getting the most possible sound quality out of your IEMs, these are 3-4 fantastic cables to choose from. And so as I said, unless you're looking for more clarity, I think the Chord 24C is absolutely the one to get. It's half the price of the other two, less than half the price of the Fusion 1. And for my money, it's actually giving the best sound because it's the most natural and coherent version of all of them. On the other hand, if you've got an IEM or a source chain where you want just that little bit more of energy, separation, or clarity, that's where the Chord 24 and or the Fusion 1 might be a great choice. And so I hope I've been able to give you a bit of a summary of what to expect from these, which one might suit you, your source chain, and your IEMs. And if the video has been useful, interesting, or entertaining, then please do hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. For now though, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.